Secrets of an Old Hut. A deep October evening descended upon the taiga like a heavy woolen blanket. The air, permeated with the scent of rotting pine needles and swamp dampness, grew thicker, and the shadows between the century-old spruce trees grew longer and more bizarre. Alexander, having lost his way at dawn, no longer hoped to find shelter before nightfall. His boots squelched on the muddy soil, each step echoing dully in the silent forest. He had been walking for 5 hours now, navigating only by the barely noticeable marks in the trees left by unknown guides. The compass was silent. The needle was spinning wildly, as if it had lost its bearings. His watch had also failed. The second hand was frozen at 12, and the dial was coated with a strange sweat inside. Suddenly, a dark silhouette flickered between the tree trunks. Alexander froze, listening to the forest symphony, the distant cry of an eagle owl, the rustle of fallen leaves under the paws of an invisible beast, the monotonous tapping of a woodpecker somewhere in the distance, and a barely perceptible creak, as if old boards were rubbing against each other in the wind. Having made his way through the dense juniper thickets, he emerged into a small clearing. In its center, like a guard forgotten by time, stood a small hut, a meeting with the past. The house looked as if it had grown out of the earth itself. Cracked logs, darkened by centuries, were covered in places with moss and lichen. The roof, sagging under the weight of decades, was overgrown in places with young fir trees. The windows, 2 narrow openings, were boarded up with thick boards, nailed in place with rusty nails. The door, warped and slanted, hung barely on its rusty hinges. A few steps away from the hut, an old well loomed black. Its once tidy frame was now leaning, and its half-rotted lid hung barely on one hinge. A strange smell rose from its depths, not just dampness, but something ancient, as if the earth itself were breathing from there. Alexander approached. Dry branches crunched under his feet, and every step echoed loudly in the silence of the forest. He pulled the door open. It creaked loudly, as if protesting the intrusion. Inside the forgotten house, crossing the threshold, he found himself in a small room where time seemed to have stopped many years ago. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The rays of the setting sun, filtering through the cracks in the walls, drew intricate patterns on the floor. In the center of the room stood a massive table covered in a layer of dust. On it sat a cast-iron pot, blackened by age, and a wooden spoon, as if abandoned in a hurry. In the corner stood a bed with a sagging bed frame and a decayed mattress, on which lay the remains of a quilt, now in tatters. Hunting gear hung on the wall, an old horn, a tattered suede bag, and a rifle with a cracked stock. Nearby stood a shelf of books, their bindings cracked, their pages yellowed and crumbling at the edges. One of the books lay open, as if someone had read it at the last moment before leaving. In the far corner, behind the stove, Alexander noticed something strange. As he approached, he spotted children's toys, a wooden horse with a broken leg, a rag doll with faded hair, and a small ball covered in dust. The sounds and smells of the taiga. The forest beyond the walls was not silent. The wind, filtering through the cracks, hummed a strange melody, a moan, a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a tawny owl hooted, and something alive seemed to move beneath the floor. Mice or something more. The scent of the taiga permeated the interior, the resin of coniferous trees, rotting leaves, and swamp mud. But mixed in with them was another aroma, sweetish, almost floral, but with a metallic tip. It seemed to come from the well. Alexander lit a match to examine the stove. The flame flickered, as if touched by an invisible wind, and for a moment the room brightened. He noticed strange marks on the wall, something like drawings or writing scratched with a knife. They resembled runes, but none of the symbols were familiar. First oddities. Deciding to start a fire, Alexander began gathering dry branches scattered in the corners. Suddenly, he heard a sound, quiet but distinct. Someone or something was moving across the roof. Footsteps, light as a cat's, but too rapid for an animal. He froze, listening. The footsteps moved toward the window, and one of the boards covering the opening shook slightly. Alexander slowly approached and pressed himself against the wall, trying not to breathe. Outside, there was only darkness and the silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. But he knew someone was there, a discovery. Deciding to distract himself from his frightening thoughts, Alexander returned to the table. Beneath a layer of dust, he felt something hard. It was a diary, a tattered one, its leather cover faded. Opening it, he began to read. The entries were written in uneven handwriting, in ink that had smudged in places from moisture. June 12th. Today is the third day we've been here. The house seems secure, but something's wrong. At night, I hear footsteps on the roof. My wife says it's the wind, but I know it's not. June 15th. The children began complaining of strange dreams. They say they see a woman in white calling them to the well. I've forbidden them to come within 10 steps of it. June 20th. Wife, she disappeared. She was looking for mushrooms near the swamp. She returned only at dawn, covered in mud, her eyes empty. She says she doesn't remember anything, but her fingers, they're covered in something white like lime. June 25th. I can't take it anymore. She's changing. Her voice has grown quieter, and her eyes, they glow in the dark. The children hide under the bed and whisper, "She came for us." The last entry was written in pencil, the letters trembling. June 30th. I'm leaving this here. If anyone finds it, know this. The well is not just a well. It calls. It waits. Don't listen to its voice. Don't look into its depths. And don't open the door when it knocks. A voice from the depths. Alexander closed the diary, feeling a chill run down his spine. He wanted to leave, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. At that moment, a sound came from behind the door, a soft, drawn-out knock, like someone gently rapping their knuckles. He turned around. The door was closed. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. And with it, a whisper rose from beneath the floor, a multitude of voices merging into one phrase. "Open up." Alexander rushed to the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. He tugged at a handle, pushed it, but it seemed rooted to the frame. Panicking, he glanced back and saw a figure slowly emerge from behind the stove. Tall, slender, in a long white dress, her face hidden in shadow. She extended her hand, and at that very moment, the door swung open. Alexander tumbled out, nearly falling. He ran, heedless, through the thorny branches across the marshy lowland, until he found himself on a familiar path. Stopping, he turned around. The hut stood in a clearing, quiet and lifeless. But a light flickered in one of the boarded-up windows, like a candle flickering for a moment. And then he heard it, a quiet, melodic voice coming from the depths of the forest. "Come back." Afterward, the next morning, Alexander reached the settlement. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were frozen in silent terror. He told them of his discovery, but none of the locals could explain the hut. The elders merely exchanged glances and said, "No one has lived there for a long time, but sometimes they see it." Alexander never returned to that forest. But every night, when the wind rustled the treetops, he seemed to hear a distant knock on the door and a whisper calling him back. And in the taiga, in a forgotten clearing, the hut still stood, and the well still waited.